All right, let's talk about HTML. We're going to start with Hypertext Markup Language. That is what it stands for. You can see the H, the T, the M, and the L, and where it comes from in red here. So the current version of HTML is HTML5. The way that the versions went, we had the original HTML, and then at some point we got all the way up to HTML4 pretty quickly. And then after that, it went to the XHTML standard, which I discussed a little bit in the last video, and as to why, because we needed stricter standards. And then that was a little bit too strict and a little bit fussy, and people thought that it was, a little restrictive and it didn't have enough features. And so, and that because XML kind of didn't allow for as many features because of its strict standards. So then another group splintered off and they started HTML5. All right, and that was the even though XHTML, it was the first to offer strict semantic markup and focus on separating what is called presentation from structure, or the visual styling from the actual structure or the HTML of the page. HTML5 now does it even better. Okay, so here's what HTML looks like. We're going to talk about the display view versus the code view. So the display view, this is what people see as a viewing audience. They see a normal website, and this is an example of a design studio that actually creates websites and other graphic design collateral for people. All right, and the same site looks like this if you were to open up the code view of it. And so this is what we see as designers and developers. And this might look a little bit confusing and chaotic right now, but later you'll actually be able to look at this and make sense of it. It'll actually make sense to you. Okay, so let's start with tags. HTML is based on the use of tags, and I have tags sort of capitalized there. That there's no good reason for that, really. It's not like it stands for something. But tags are the beginnings and endings of element declarations, and they tell the browser how to process any given data. So let's take a look and see what a tag looks like. This is the basic anatomy of a tag. All right, so as I said before, all HTML is built on the concept of tags and the way that you mark tags up. So in this example, this is a dummy example. It's not a real tag name, but we've got the tag name opening, and then we've got the closing tag name, and the stuff that's in between where it says blah blah blah, that's the stuff that would if it were in the part of the page that displays, it's what would actually show up on the page for a viewing audience. There are some sections of the website that don't show up for the viewing audience, and I'll get to that in a little bit, but the tag is going to affect whatever is nested inside of it in between that opening and closing. So here it could also look like this, and it's exactly the same and valid. Let's jump back up. You see everything here is on one line, and there are no spaces or tabs before blah 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 or after blah blah blah. It just is surrounded right next to blah 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 by the tag names beginning and ending. All right, and then here it looks a little different, but it would show up exactly the same in the browser because the excess white space outside of the tags, it doesn't matter, right? That white space does not matter. The blah 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 portion will only display a single space character in between words also, regardless of how many consecutive spaces or tabs you type. So like that tab that is tabbed in where it says blah blah blah, that wouldn't show up as a tab. It wouldn't show up even as a space actually. It just would show blah blah blah. Okay, I just ignored it. All right, so tags, almost all of them have an opening tag, which you see here in red, right? And then a closing tag, which you see here in this next slide in red. And you see that the way that they are different from each other is that the opening tag, right, it just goes left angle bracket, and then it's got the tag name, and then it's got right angle bracket, whereas the closing tag, it goes left angle bracket /, and then the tag name, and then the right angle bracket. So that / there indicates that that's the end of the tag name. Okay, so Here's a real example of a tag. This is a paragraph tag, and its designator is the letter P. So you've got, you know, left angle, you've got P, and then you've got right angle, and then you would type whatever you want for your paragraph to be inside of that, and then you would close it with left angle / P right angle bracket. Okay, these are real examples of heading level tags, right? You just like in a newspaper, when you're reading a newspaper, you know, you've got bigger, bolder things that look like headings, and sometimes they've got subheadings with paragraphs and stuff to help you understand the hierarchy. We also have semantic markup that is meaningful, so that we've got these things called heading levels, and they go from an H1 all the way down to H6. And H1 is the most important heading level. And in fact, it's so important that in previous versions of HTML, you were only ever supposed to have one H1 on the page, because it was like the most important thing. Typically, it would be maybe the name of the website, right? So that it would be the site identifier. And nowadays with HTML5, technically you can have more than one H1 on a single page, but still some people, as a best practice, they like to only still have one H1. It really just depends on the designer and developer who you're talking to. So I will accept that either way, but just know that a lot of times an H1 is still something you're only going to find one time on a page. The H2 should always be nested under an H1, meaning that you would never put an H2 before you would put an H1. It would never happen that way, not at least not in a valid markup situation. Same is true for an H3. You would never skip straight from an H1 all the way down to an H3. And that might seem like common sense, but you know, before CSS, styling was a thing, people used to try to skip levels because a browser would by default make an H1, you know, visibly really big and bold, and it would make an H2 only a little bit smaller than that, big and bold, right? But maybe they didn't want the H2 to be that big, and so they would skip down to something like an H5 or an H6 to make it look smaller, even though really what it should have been was the heading level 2. And so this is where we get into the idea of semantic markup, where there's actually meaning imbued in each of these tags. And so you want to make sure that you are putting them in the right order inside of the document and making sure that the hierarchy is good. Okay, these are real examples of unordered lists and their list items. You have some different types of lists. There's the most common types of lists are going to be unordered lists and ordered lists. There are also some things called definition lists, but I'm not going to talk about them right now. An unordered list is something that typically, if you didn't give it your own styling with CSS, a browser by default would style it so that it had bullets. And because there's no specific order, you're just giving a list of stuff, like a grocery list maybe. And the way that it looks is here you would see you've got your opening UL tag for unordered list. And then inside of the unordered list, before you end it, you've got some list items. And the way that the list items go is you open the list item tag, you write what the list item is, and then you close the list item, and then you start the next one, and so on and so on. And at the end of the list items, you would put your ending UL tag. Okay, the same is going to be true for an ordered list, except that instead of UL, it's OL. So you can see just by me going through some of these examples that HTML is extremely intuitive. It's a very simple markup language. I mean, OL means ordered list, UL means unordered list item is LI, paragraph is P, heading level is H1 or H2. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, so it's not really hard to remember a lot of these things. And of course, ordered lists will indicate sequence. By default, if there's no styling, a browser will make them numerical, 1, 2, 3, 4. You can also tell them to be like A, B, C, D, and so on, or Roman numerals. Okay, so tags that are self-closing are also a thing. Like so far I showed you tags that have an opening tag and an ending tag. Well, there are some things that are referred to as empty elements. That's what they're technically called, but a lot of people refer to those as self-closing tags, so that they don't have a beginning specifically and an end. It's just everything that it needs is encompassed inside of the initial tag. All right, so it opens and closes itself without having to have a second tag. All right, so here is an example of probably the most common empty element, which is an image tag, and I find the word empty element kind of confusing, and I try not to use it very often because technically you don't think of an image as something that would be empty, right? Because it would have a picture in it. So I like to think of this image tag as a self-closing tag. All right, so IMG is the designator for the tag name. And then you've got some other information that we're going to get to in a minute in some future slides. But you've got these things called attributes and values that basically give us more information about where to go find the image, right? And then you see there, I give you two valid examples of how you can write a self-closing tag using HTML5. The top one, the very first one in green for each of these, has a / at the end right before the right angle bracket. But then you'll see in blue those don't have that ending / right? In HTML5, you don't have to put the ending /. In any previous version prior to HTML5, you are supposed to use that / and for valid markup. Okay, so there's the image file. That one is a really common self-closing tag. Line break, it uses the BR for break, right? That's a really, really common one. Another common one is HR for horizontal rule. There's some other ones, but these are really probably the most common three that you're going to use frequently. And then this tag list goes on and on. All right, I'm not going to make you memorize all of them right at the beginning of the class, so don't worry. There are some really common ones. I showed you some of the really common ones. There are more than that that we're going to use in our assignments in the beginning. But this list is just really, really long, and you're going to learn them more and more as you use them. Okay, so a tag can also be referred to as an element. So an element, let's just jump back up here really quickly. I want to show you an example of an element. So an element like this OL, all right, that could be referred to as a tag or as an element. Elements can have multiple other things inside of it. A tag typically is only just the thing itself, but a lot of times what you're going to find is you're going to find an element that might have lots of other tags inside of it. For instance, if you have an article tag, you might have nested inside of it like a header, a heading level, a paragraph, a list. Well, that article is a tag, but if you're referring to everything that's inside of it, you would be referring to the entire element because the article has multiple things inside of it. If that's not completely obvious in the way that I mean that, it'll become a lot more obvious later when we start getting into the coding. And if you want to look at this website, you can. It's developer.mozilla.org. It's a really good website. If you have questions, you want to look something up, they have a really, really good documentation section. Okay, let's talk about tags and their parts. A tag, as I mentioned before, can also have these things called attributes. So if you look at this example right here, we have an anchor tag. And if you look at what is in red, that is what is the tag designation. So you have A that stands for anchor. And by the way, an anchor tag is a link that goes somewhere when clicked. All right, so inside this A tag, you see where it says look something up here. Well, where it says look something up here, that's the text on the actual browser screen that would be clickable because it's wrapped inside of these anchor tags, right? So the A tag is in red, and then you need to know where the link is going to take you, so you have to have a thing called href for hyperreference. That's what it stands for. Okay, so href stands for hyperreference, and that would tell you, where it's supposed to go. All right, but I actually need a value to attach to that hyperreference. All right, so here in purple, if you look at this, what we've got now is we've got a thing that says http://google.com. So if I click where it says look something up here on the screen when I'm looking in the browser, it's going to take me to the value of google.com because that's the hyperreference of this particular anchor link. Okay. All right. If you need to pause on this and take a look at that, rewind it and understand it, go right ahead. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about nesting tags. All right, to make pages, we have to nest tags within each other to develop page structure and hierarchy. So an example of nesting, I kind of was mentioning this before, is let's say we have an article and that I have that in red. So the article is in red, and inside of the article, it's a best practice for any kind of article that you always have what's referred to as a header that would be at the beginning of the article, so that inside of the header there's some sort of heading level inside of it, whether it's an H1 or H2 or whatever. It needs to have some sort of heading level, so that it basically would be like if you're reading a newspaper, you get an article heading that tells you what the article is about. Well, that's really important that this markup is useful, because if somebody who's blind is using an assistive device like a screen reader, it needs to understand that that article is about print versus web in this example, for instance. Okay, and so this is the right way that you would mark it up. So the way that we nest, you'll see that it's really common to tab stuff in whenever it's nested inside of another tag. And the reason for that is because it makes it visually easier to see what the organization is in the code view. So in this, we've got a header, which is in this case in blue, and it's nested inside of the article. Nested inside of the header, we have a thing called the H1, which is in green. Okay, and then the header ends itself before it gets to the next thing, which is a paragraph. And so inside of the article, we have what are referred to as two, either you could call them two children or two descendants of the article. And those two children and descendants are header and paragraph. Now technically the article has three descendants, because a descendant can be a child, a grandchild, a great-grandchild, whatever, right? So technically we have three descendants, because there is an H1 inside the article, there's a header inside the article, and there's a paragraph inside the article. But if you wanted to talk about direct children relationship, we only have two children inside the article. The H1 is a child of the header, okay? You can also look at that in reverse too. You can look at article as the ancestor of the header, H1, and paragraph, right? And these are real words. I'm not making this up. We really do refer to these relationships as child-parent relationships or ancestor-descendant relationships, okay? And so it makes sense if you think about it. So again, if you need to pause this and kind of work that out in your head, go right ahead. Okay, so again, about nesting tags, you have to nest them properly for valid markup. So if you look at the one that's got the check mark next to it in green, it's a paragraph tag. So inside of that paragraph tag, it has an anchor nested inside of it. The one that has the red X next to it is improperly nested and would actually give you fits in certain browsers. It would not give you valid markup, and it might mess up parts of your page, because you see here we start with a P tag, we go to an A tag, and then we end the P before we end the A. So you have to make sure that you're nesting stuff and starting and stopping your tags in the right places. So again, you can pause this, look at the correct example of nesting, make sure you understand that order, and compare it to the incorrect, and make sure that you understand how not to do it. Okay, I'm going to stop this here, and then the next video we're going to talk about required parts of the HTML page.